It's easy to forget how Hulk Hogan transcended wrestling to become a household name in the 1980s, a true megastar, mentioned in the same breath as the likes of Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, real-life superheroes in the minds of millions of people. Wrestling fans of the 1980s will recall Hogan's meteoric rise coinciding with the explosion of Vince McMahon's vision for wrestling as larger-than-life cartoon sports entertainment. The two men were very much a team, and there's a strong argument that without their symbiotic relationship, neither man would have reached the heights that they did. Today, many wrestling fans look at Hogan with either nostalgia or indifference, but God knows he managed to hang on to a top spot in wrestling for decades after the 1980s, and that wasn't through saying his prayers and taking his vitamins alone. Hogan's rapid ascent to the top of the wrestling business was like no other, becoming wrestling's number one babyface and then wrestling's number one bad guy. Getting to the top of the metaphorical wrestling ladder and staying there are two different things, and stories of Hogan's politicking, lies and self-serving attitude have abounded for years, making him one of wrestling's most hated men. It is true that Vince McMahon made Hulk Hogan, and arguably Hulk Hogan helped to make WWE, but let's rewind even further back to the year 1979 and Vince McMahon Sr., the man who founded the World Wrestling Federation. Vince Sr. was the man that set Hogan on the road to superstardom, instantly impressed with young Terry Bollea's physique and quickly seeing his overflowing charisma as he appeared in front of crowds at Madison Square Garden and across the northeast of America. It was a different time and kayfabe was still held in high regard, so when Hogan got the offer to play Thunderlips in Rocky III opposite Sylvester Stallone, McMahon Sr. was set against the idea and told him not to do it. Mr. McMahon Sr. said, "Well, if you do the movie, you're fired." So I did the movie and got fired. The words were, "You'll never work here again." Hogan took the movie job and waved a disgruntled Vince McMahon Sr. goodbye forever. As he would discover later in his career, transferring from the ring to the film set was not a natural step for the Hulkster. Sylvester Stallone recounted stories of Hogan while working on Rocky III, specifically about Hogan clumsily injuring him and several stuntmen. Stallone said, "I remember a violent move where he threw me into the corner, charged across the ring like an enraged bull. He leapt so amazingly high above me that his shin bone came down like a giant tree on my collarbone. I tumbled to the floor, but I was afraid to look at my shoulder for about 10 minutes. I said, 'Don't roll over me, don't move me,' because I was sure that there was bone protruding through my upper chest. Of course, there wasn't, but he jumped into the audience to fight with the stunt performers. 3 of them had to be treated at the hospital. While Hogan got his name in the World Wrestling Federation, he was actually forged in the fires of the American Wrestling Association, where territory boss Verne Gagne saw fans fall in love with Hogan and realised his massive upside as a babyface wrestler. There were plans afoot to make Hogan the AWA World Champion in 1983, and he was programmed in main events against champion Nick Bockwinkel. The men faced off at the Super Sunday show in Minnesota for the belt, and while Hogan won the match clean with the leg drop, the contest would end up being thrown out due to Hogan throwing Bockwinkel over the top rope. It was expected that this would lead to a series of matches between the men, culminating in Hogan winning the championship later in the year. It wasn't to be, as Hogan managed to fall out with promoter number 2, this time over merchandising percentages. Hogan would have no such problem with promoter number 3, however, at least not for a decade or so anyway. When Hogan returned to the Northeast, things had changed. Vince McMahon Jr. had purchased WWE from his dad, and he had designs on making the promotion a national entity. Hogan was handpicked to become McMahon's main attraction in this grand plan. That grand plan pissed off a lot of regional promoters who quite rightly forecasted the oncoming storm of Hulkamania and WWE's national expansion. McMahon wanted to put all of the regional promotions out of business and become the king and conqueror of the entire industry. Vince McMahon's threat to the status quo of American wrestling was recognised by the likes of Harley Race, who was incensed when WWE invaded the NWA territory of Kansas City. Ric Flair said, "Harley was so goddamn mad at WWE, WWF at the time, and he's leaving me to wrestle Bruiser Brody over there, and we had 3,000 people. He's going over to the convention centre to kill Hulk." He pulled out his 9mm tucked into his pants and goes, "I'll be back." The story goes that Race had tried to set the ring on fire before pulling the gun on Hogan as he was coming out of the bathroom. Luckily, in the end, Race opted not to blow Hogan's kneecaps off. Hogan was benefiting from WWE's explosion in popularity during the mid-80s, with the guys from the top to the bottom of the card making more money from the business than ever before. But the old guard at the time were forced to make way for Vince McMahon Jr., Hulk Hogan, and this new cartoon era of wrestling. The likes of the Iron Sheik and Bob Backlund, both of which enjoyed great success under Vince Sr., were forced to bend to the will of these two new punks. Backlund had reigned as WWE champion for 6 long years under Vince McMahon Sr., but when Vince Jr. brought the company off his dad in 1982, the writing was on the wall. Old school grappler Backlund in no way fitted the younger McMahon's cartoon-like, mainstream appealing vision of wrestling. McMahon cut Back belt himself. Back didn't meet the standards outside the ring to be able to represent the WWF. Did the WWE fire him recently? Because I would have fired him 30 years ago. He was saying one thing and doing another. The Iron Sheik seems to have a lot of ill will towards the Hulkster too, apparently stemming from his victory over him during the aforementioned feud against Hogan, which never happened. Sheiky Baby has made his feelings very well known about this situation over and over and over again, in fact, in a series of revealing tweets. Before WrestleMania 2 in 1986, Jesse Ventura says that he tried to unionise the locker room. In an interview, Ventura claims that he stood up in front of the boys in the back and told them that now was their chance. It was just the boys present at the time in the locker room. Absolutely nobody from management was present. As WrestleMania 2 was about to air live, Ventura realised that this was the best opportunity they had to unionise, considering the show was booked and they could have McMahon over a barrel. Only problem was, someone stooged Ventura off to McMahon before the union could be formed. Ventura said, "The next day my phone rang and it was Vince. He came within an eyelash of firing me." Ventura jumped before he was pushed, as he had a bigger offer on the table thanks to the Predator movie he was about to star in opposite Arnold Schwarzenegger. 10 weeks later, the movie was in the can and Ventura strolled back into WWE. Ventura was a mainstream movie star now, and NBC wanted him on their WWE Saturday Night's main event show, and so McMahon had to allow him back into the fold. Ventura would later sue McMahon in court for royalty payments, and it was in court that McMahon revealed that Hogan had told him about the plans to unionise. Ventura said, "I didn't show no emotion, but I almost fell to the floor because Hogan was a friend. I thought, my God, it was Hogan who stooged me to Vince," and Hogan denies it. Well, Vince admitted it under oath in a federal deposition, and he also admitted it on the Larry King show, because Larry breached the subject with him. So you tell me who's lying, Hogan or Vince? Randy Savage was known to be an intensely paranoid individual, and when his wife Elizabeth was involved, that intensity in wrestling championship matches together at WrestleMania 5 in 1989, but even so, Savage couldn't trust Hogan. In an interview with Steve Austin, Hogan said, "Elizabeth was my manager and we went to the ring in Paris. There were no steps. Elizabeth was probably 95 or 100 pounds soaking wet, so I reached over the top rope, reached all the way over where she's standing next to me and grabbed her by the armpits. I picked her all the way up, she had a dress on, and put her in the ring. Randy said, "You son of a bitch, you grabbed her boobs." We walk up and he grabs a headlock on me, but he puts that side headlock on me. I'm hanging in there. And I didn't want my eyeball to pop out, so I grabbed his waist and I squeezed. "Randy, if you don't let go, I'm going to dump you on your head." He was so pissed at me. The match sucked. It's alleged that Savage would later blame Hogan and his wife Linda for turning Elizabeth against him. In an interview, the Ultimate Warrior said, Hogan and his wife and McMahon planted ideas in her head that she was missing out on some magnificent untamed life adventure. Elizabeth had become close friends with Hogan's wife Linda, and she'd been staying at the Hogan household, and it was from there that she told Savage that she wanted a divorce. At WrestleMania 9 in 1993, Hogan was sporting a black eye, supposedly gained from a jet ski accident. However, Jim Cornette has alleged that it was Savage who punched Hogan in the face. Savage found out that Elizabeth had run off to Hogan's house and was staying with Linda because Linda and Elizabeth were friends, and Hogan didn't tell Savage that she was there, which is why, when Savage confronted him with that, he confronted him by punching him in the fucking eye, and that's why Hogan had a black eye at WrestleMania 9. Matt Bourne, better known as Doink the Clown, witnessed the situation firsthand. He said, "He was an arrogant fuck. I still think he is. I look at him and laugh because I know him for who he truly is. I don't like him. I really find it hard to even like him as a person. He's a phony inside and out. He showed that when he did that to Randy. When he said that him and Randy had made up after Randy had died, well, that's bullshit. Randy hated Hogan." It was a grudge that Savage held for years after, as he labelled Hogan a punk and a coward in his Be a Man rap song. For the Ultimate Warrior, his jealousy of Hogan almost drove him mad. As the 1980s were drawing to a close, Hogan was looking to transition from wrestling to Hollywood and become a film star, and McMahon was itching to crown a new megastar world champion to take him into the 1990s. The Ultimate Warrior was primed to take that spot and be the new merchandise shifting superhero to millions of fans worldwide, and he won the belt from Hogan at WrestleMania 6, despite Hogan almost kicking out, of course. Warrior later found out that Hogan earned $1 million for the match while he was only paid $500,000. Warrior seethed on that fact for months before threatening to no-show at SummerSlam 1991 unless his financial demands were met. McMahon promised Warrior the money before firing him. By 1992, Hogan was back in the Federation and new talent had emerged in the interim, as Hogan was scheduled to face Psycho Sid, forcing Sid to be eliminated himself by pulling him out of the ring. The fans naturally started booing Hogan, and Hogan didn't like that one bit. Sid claimed that Hogan went crying to Vince that Sid was trying to get cheers over him. Sid was almost so annoyed that he wanted to leave WWE. In an interview, he said, "At the Royal Rumble, when they booed Hogan, Hogan came back into the locker room screaming and crying at Vince and saying that he planned that to happen to him. Hogan's self-serving was blatant enough to rub many wrestlers up the wrong way, Bret Hart being a prime example." After the Ultimate Warrior imploded, Bret Hart was being lined up by McMahon as the babyface successor to WWE's main event throne, and Hart vs Hogan should have been a WrestleMania main event, but it never happened. According to rumours, Hogan had flat out refused to put the Hitman over when he first broke into WWE. On April 2nd, 1993, I went to my room just in time to answer a call from Vince, who asked me to come to his suite to talk. I knocked on his door and he answered it with that goofy grin. We sat down and Vince said, "This is what I want to do. I want you to drop the belt to Yoko tomorrow." This was not what I'd expected. I sat there dumbstruck as he went on to explain how Fuji would screw me by throwing salt in my face, blinding me. After Yoko was handed the belt, Hogan would rush to my aid, and in some kind of roundabout way, Hogan would end up winning the belt from Yoko right then and there. Like I was handing Vince my sword, I told him I appreciate everything he did for me and I'd do whatever he wanted. Vince said, "Don't get bitter, I still have big plans for you." Sound bites flashed through my mind of Vince assuring me that I was long-term champion and not to worry about Hulk Hogan, who still hadn't even spoken to me yet. The match went ahead and the finish played out as McMahon had said to Bret, with Hogan defeating Yokozuna and once again becoming WWE champion. Hart was livid with Hogan. A few minutes later, backstage, Hogan came up to me excited and happy and said, "Thank you, brother. I won't forget it. I'll be happy to return the favour." I looked my old friend in the eye and said, "I'm going to remember that, Terry." Hogan never did properly return the favour to Bret apart from a 10-minute match in WCW, which Hart won via disqualification. It was hoped that Hart could face Hogan at SummerSlam 93, but by then Hogan was out the door in WWE and he dropped the belt back to Yokozuna, a King of the Ring instead. Bret said, "Hogan couldn't bear the thought of wrestling me and making me, so he completely buried the knife in me and made sure that he never worked with me." Hart never really forgave Hogan for that time, and Hart still seethes about him to this day. In the modern world of wrestling, you'd think that the current crop of superstars would have little reason to think about Hogan, let alone hate him. By 2015, Hogan had settled into a Legends role back with WWE, popping up occasionally to trip over his lines and get the name of the stadium wrong at WrestleMania, but it mostly felt like Grandad Hogan was fairly harmless and on the Legends tour at this point in his career. In July 2015, Hogan was caught on tape making anti-black racist remarks and literally saying that he was racist to a point. And that was a shame for fans in particular, as we'd all heard the rumour and the innuendo about how Hogan was self-serving and a politician. But this was different. This wasn't just business. It wasn't just accusation. Those were the actual disgusting remarks coming from his own mouth. WWE terminated their contract with Hogan on July the 24th, with them basically erasing him from their product, removing his merchandise from the store and taking away his entry on the Hall of Fame page. WWE champion at the time, Kofi Kingston, registered his and his New Day teammates' feelings on the subject via Twitter. He said, "On a personal level, when someone makes racist and hateful comments about any race or group of people, especially to the degree that Hogan made about our people, we find it difficult to simply forget, regardless of how long ago it was or the situation in which those comments are made." Mark Henry said, "I'm disappointed in the comments made by Terry Bollea. I've known Terry for a long time as both a work colleague and as someone I consider a friend. I'm hurt and offended that he expressed his feelings in the manner and tone that was presented on the tape. I am, however, pleased that the WWE took the swift action in response to his comments, and I support the position the organisation is taking in this matter, a no-tolerance approach to racism." Hogan appeared on Good Morning America and said that he blamed his use of racial slurs on the South Tampa neighbourhood he lived in during his childhood, and that the N-word was part of growing up in that area. Incredibly, Hogan was welcomed back to WWE in 2018 and they put him back in the Hall of Fame as if the comments he made were just water under the bridge. "I think Hulk Hogan is a piece of shit," said CM Punk in an interview. Punk said that they crossed paths on the 15th anniversary episode of Raw, where Punk had hoped to make a great first impression when Hogan walked past him backstage. He had his entourage with him and I jumped in front of him to say, "Hi Mr. Hogan, CM Punk, nice to meet you, blah blah blah." And he walked right past me, blew me out, didn't shake my hand, had no time. Punk went on to compare that to how he was treated by Steve Austin, who always had all the time in the world for him. Shawn Michaels was always considered to be a handful, particularly during his 1990s run in which he was almost consumed by personal demons and displayed utter contempt for almost everyone around him. But by his return run in the 2000s, everything seemed to have changed for the Heartbreak Kid. After his return to wrestling in 2002, Michaels was like a new man and was on a huge run that looked like it might even surpass his 90s peak. Hogan was back in WWE too, and by SummerSlam 2005, both men were on a collision course in a highly anticipated Legends vs Icon match, and fans were excited to see what Michaels could do with Hogan in the ring. The match wouldn't be remembered in the same way as the legendary match between Hogan vs The Rock, however, as Shawn Michaels made a mockery of the clash by overselling everything that Hogan gave him. Rewinding to before the match, Michaels had pitched for them to work 3 matches culminating in a steel cage match. It certainly would have been remembered as one of the classic feuds of the 2000s, and maybe Michaels would have been able to drag Hogan to some of the best matches of his career. It would be a babyface versus babyface feud to see who was better, with Hogan coming out on top in the end. But it wasn't to be. Story goes that Hogan decided that he wanted it to be a face versus heel feud, with HBK playing the bad guy. Michaels doing his best stuntman impression during their SummerSlam match was his way of throwing the match back in Hogan's face for changing the plan. Years later, Michaels said, "We were going to do a best of 3 and in the last minute Hogan backed out. So that day, and I will admit this, I poked the bear all day. I already knew what I was going to do. I was going to go out there and do business, but I was going to make him earn it just to be a pain in the butt all day. And that was something I just did for my own enjoyment. It wasn't right and it wasn't professional." This video has only touched on Hogan's time spent in WWE, but naturally Hogan's transition to WCW rubbed his fellow wrestlers up the wrong way too. Scott Steiner remembered when he, Hogan and Savage worked in WCW, and specifically remembered how Savage hated Hogan. Steiner took offence to Hogan entering Savage posthumously into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2015. Hogan alleged that Steiner threatened to murder him over this, as TMZ reported that Hulk's wife Jennifer flew into San Jose for WrestleMania and claimed that Steiner grabbed her at baggage claim and told her that he was planning to kill Terry. Hogan called the cops on Steiner. Steiner said, "I'm not going to dignify Hogan's lies. I didn't put my hands on her. I told her Hulk introducing Macho Man into the Hall of Fame is bullshit. He hated him. Everyone knew that." You know, I could go on and on in this video, honestly. The list of people with problems surrounding Hogan is huge. I haven't touched on the utterly scathing comments made by the likes of the honky tonk